In the autumn of the year of our Lord, 1290, in a small monastery on the cliffs of southern France, an old knight lay dying. He had been a fighting man for 40 years. He had ridden in the last of the great Crusades. He had seen the burning of cities and the falling of kingdoms. He had watched friends die in deserts whose names he could no longer pronounce, and he had buried with his own hands more men than he had been able to count. His name was Sir Aldrich of Velmore. He was 64 years old. He had served 3 kings. He had fought in 19 battles. And on the morning of his death, with the autumn sun coming through the small window of his cell and the sound of the sea below, he called for the youngest brother of the monastery to come to him. The brother's name was Ansel. He was 17 years old. He had taken his vows only a year earlier. And he was, in that moment, the only person Sir Aldrich trusted to carry forward the burden the old knight had been carrying alone for 30 years. This is the story Sir Aldrich told the young brother that morning, in the hours before he died. It is the story of a quest that took him from the burning streets of Acre to the high mountains of the Pyrenees. A quest that began with a promise made over a dying king and ended with a treasure that could not be spoken of in any tongue. A quest that, in the end, would haunt Sir Aldrich for the rest of his life, even though he had succeeded. This is the story of the secret quest, the story that no chronicler has ever recorded, the story that has been waiting, patient as old stones, for a listener who could hear it without flinching. Settle in, traveler. Let the candle burn low. Let the autumn wind move across the hills outside. The story is long. The night is long, and what you are about to hear has been a secret for so many centuries that the world above has forgotten it ever happened at all. In the year 1247, Sir Aldrich of Velmore was 21 years old. He had been a knight for only 2 years. He served in the household of King Alphonse of Brittany, a small kingdom on the western coast of France that no longer exists today. The kingdom of Brittany at that time was caught in a difficult position. It was too small to act on its own and too proud to fully bend the knee to the larger powers around it. King Alphonse was a careful man, a man who thought deeply about every decision, a man who had spent his entire reign trying to keep his small kingdom alive in a world of larger predators. In the spring of that year, King Alphonse received a letter from the Pope in Rome. The letter requested that the king send a contingent of knights to join the new crusade that was being organized to recover the holy places in Outremer. The king did not want to send his knights. He needed them at home. The eastern lands were far away, and the politics of the crusade were complicated, and Alphonse had little appetite for sending his best men to die in deserts on behalf of a cause that did not directly serve his small kingdom. But the Pope was not someone Alphonse could easily refuse. So the king did what kings often do when they cannot say no but cannot afford to say yes. He sent the smallest contingent he could justify, 12 knights, 12 squires, a handful of men at arms, just enough to satisfy the Pope, not enough to weaken his own defenses. Sir Aldrich of Velmore was one of the 12. He had not asked to go. He had not refused to go. He had simply been told by his liege lord that he was going. And he had done what young knights did in those days. He had nodded. He had thanked his lord for the honor. He had gone home and packed his belongings and said goodbye to his mother, who had wept quietly while serving him his last meal at home, and to his father, who had given him a small leather pouch of coins and a silver ring that had belonged to his grandfather. And then he had ridden out, in the early dawn of a spring morning, on the long road east to the Holy Land. The journey took 6 months. Aldrich and the other knights travelled overland to Marseille, then by ship across the Mediterranean to the port of Acre, which was at that time the last great Christian stronghold in the Holy Land. Aldrich had never been on a ship before. He spent most of the voyage being sick over the rail. By the time they arrived at Acre, he had lost almost 10 pounds and had developed a deep distrust of the sea that would last for the rest of his life. But the Holy Land changed him. The moment he stepped off the ship at Acre, he understood that he had entered a world he had not been prepared for. The heat was different. The smells were different. The languages were different. Acre in those days was a strange and dazzling place, a Christian city in a Muslim land, full of merchants from every corner of the known world. There were Italian traders, and German pilgrims and French nobles. There were Syriac priests and Ethiopian monks. There were Mongol envoys and Mamluk spies. There were diplomats from Constantinople, philosophers from Cordoba, and weary old crusaders who had been in the Holy Land for so long that they no longer remembered the names of the towns they had been born in. Aldrich and the other knights of Brittany were quickly absorbed into the larger machinery of the Crusader kingdoms. They were assigned to a fortress on the coast, a small castle called St. Gilles, which guarded a stretch of road between Acre and a smaller town to the south. The duty was not difficult. There were occasional skirmishes with bandits and small Muslim raiding parties, but mostly the knights of St. Gilles spent their days drilling, mending equipment, and watching the road for travelers who needed escort. It was at St. Gilles that Aldrich met the man who would change his life. The man's name was Brother Gabriel. He was a monk of an obscure order whose name even Aldrich, decades later, could not pronounce correctly. The order had its mother house somewhere in the Caucasus mountains, and most of its members were Eastern Christians who had been driven west by the constant wars of the region. Brother Gabriel himself was a small man, thin, with intense dark eyes, and a face that had been weathered by too many years in the desert. He spoke 5 languages fluently, and several others well enough to make himself understood. He knew secrets, many secrets, about the Holy Land, about the wars, about the strange and ancient things buried in the deep places of the Christian East. Brother Gabriel had arrived at St. Gilles late one evening, alone, on a grey mule, carrying nothing but a small leather satchel and a wooden walking staff. He asked for shelter for the night. The captain of the fortress, who knew him from previous visits, granted it without question. Brother Gabriel was given a small cell in the chapel wing of the castle. He spent the evening in prayer, and in the morning, before he left, he asked the captain if he might have a word with one of the young knights. The young knight he asked to speak with was Aldrich. Aldrich had no idea, when he entered the small chapel where Brother Gabriel was waiting for him, that this conversation would shape the rest of his life. He thought, perhaps, that the monk wanted to discuss some small matter of religious instruction. Maybe there was a service Brother Gabriel needed help with. Maybe he had a message for one of the older knights and needed Aldrich to deliver it. What Brother Gabriel actually wanted was something very different. The monk looked at Aldrich for a long time when the young knight came in. He studied his face. He studied his hands. He noticed the small silver ring on Aldrich's finger, the one his father had given him before he left Brittany. He noticed the slight calluses on Aldrich's palms from holding a sword. He noticed the way Aldrich carried himself, neither too proud nor too humble, neither too eager nor too cautious. And after a long silence, Brother Gabriel asked Aldrich a question that the young knight would remember word for the rest of his life. "Sir Aldrich," the monk said in his careful French, "have you ever wondered what you were truly meant to do with your life?" Aldrich did not know how to answer this question. He was 21 years old. He had been raised to be a knight. He had been raised to serve a king. He had not been raised to ask philosophical questions about the nature of his own purpose. "I am here to serve King Alphonse and the Holy Father," he answered finally. "That is what I am meant to do." Brother Gabriel smiled. It was a small smile, but a real one. He nodded slowly. "That is what you have been told to do," he said. "It is not the same thing as what you are meant to do. Most men live their entire lives without ever encountering the difference. A few men, a very few men, are given the chance to discover what they are truly meant to do. And of those few, an even smaller number have the courage to actually do it." The monk paused. He looked at Aldrich with those intense dark eyes. "I think, Sir Aldrich, that you may be one of those very few men. I have come a long way to find you. I have been searching for you for some time. And if you are willing to listen to what I have come to say, I think you will find that the rest of your life, however long or short it may be, will not be the life you thought you were going to live." Aldrich should have walked out of that chapel. He should have laughed at the strange little monk and gone back to his duties. He should have, at the very least, gone to find his captain and asked for guidance about how to handle this odd encounter. But Aldrich did none of those things. Something in Brother Gabriel's voice held him in place. Something in the way the monk had been waiting for him, calmly, in the morning sunlight of an empty chapel. Something in the unsettling sense that the monk's words were true. That there was, somewhere underneath the surface of Aldrich's life, a different life waiting for him, a life he had not yet found because he had not yet been given the chance to look for it. So Aldrich sat down on the small wooden bench across from Brother Gabriel. He folded his hands in his lap, and he listened. What Brother Gabriel told him over the next 3 hours was a story so strange that Aldrich, even decades later, could barely believe he had heard it. The story began with an old kingdom, a kingdom that had existed in the eastern reaches of the Roman Empire more than 1,000 years before. A small Christian kingdom in the mountains, ruled by a line of kings who had been chosen in the very early days of the church to guard a particular treasure. The treasure was not gold. The treasure was not jewels. The treasure was something stranger, something the church had decided at the very beginning had to be kept safe and hidden until a particular moment in the future when it would be needed again. What the treasure actually was, Brother Gabriel said, he could not tell Aldrich, not because he did not trust him. He did, but because the nature of the treasure was protected by a series of vows that bound everyone who knew about it. Aldrich would be told what the treasure was only if he agreed to take on the quest. And the quest, Brother Gabriel said, was very simple in its description and very difficult in its execution. The kingdom that had guarded the treasure had fallen more than 200 years earlier. The line of kings had been broken. The fortress in which the treasure had been kept had been taken by Mongol raiders and burned to the ground. The keepers of the treasure, the small order of monks and warriors who had been entrusted with its protection, had been scattered. Some had been killed. Some had fled into the surrounding mountains. Some had taken the treasure with them and tried, with the resources they had, to keep it safe. For 200 years, the treasure had been moved from hiding place to hiding place across the Christian East. It had been hidden in monasteries in Anatolia. It had been carried by traveling priests through the Caucasus. It had spent decades in a cave in Armenia, in a vault in Trebizond, in a small chapel on the shores of the Black Sea. The keepers of the treasure had grown smaller in number with each generation. New men had been recruited carefully and slowly to replace the old. But the constant moving had taken its toll, and by the time Brother Gabriel sat in that chapel at St. Gilles, the order of keepers had dwindled to fewer than a dozen men, scattered across the Eastern Christian world. Brother Gabriel was one of them. He was, in fact, the senior member of the order. He had been a keeper of the treasure for 30 years. He was old enough now that he could no longer travel safely with the treasure himself, and he had been given a final mission by the Council of Keepers in the East to find the treasure a permanent home. A home in the Western Christian world, far from the wars that had been consuming the Eastern lands. A home where it could be safely hidden for as long as the church had need of it. The home that the council had chosen, after long deliberation, was a particular monastery in the south of France. A small, isolated monastery on the cliffs above the sea, far from any major city, far from any battlefield, far from the politics of kings and popes. The monastery had been founded by a hermit 200 years earlier and had remained small and quiet ever since. Its abbot was a friend of the keepers, a man who had been told just enough to understand what he was being asked to take on, and who had agreed to receive the treasure when it arrived. What the keepers needed, Brother Gabriel told Aldrich, was someone to carry the treasure from the Holy Land to that monastery. The journey was long and dangerous. It would take more than a year. It would require crossing through territories controlled by Muslim armies, through territories controlled by hostile Christian factions, through ports controlled by greedy merchants and bandits. It would require crossing the Mediterranean, then crossing the Pyrenees, then crossing nearly all of southern France, all the while keeping the treasure hidden from anyone who might try to take it. The keepers needed a man for this mission, a particular kind of man. He had to be young enough to survive the rigors of the journey. He had to be skilled enough with arms to defend himself when the inevitable attacks came. He had to be loyal enough to be trusted with a secret of this magnitude, and he had to be obscure enough that his disappearance from his current life would not draw attention. A famous knight, an experienced commander would be missed. He would be searched for. He would be unable to disappear. A young, unknown knight from a small kingdom no one cared about, on the other hand, could vanish into the eastern lands and reappear 18 months later in a remote monastery in southern France, and no one would know to ask any questions. Aldrich, sitting on that wooden bench in the chapel of St. Gilles, understood that he was being asked to abandon his life, to give up his service to King Alphonse, to give up his family in Brittany, to give up the future that had been planned for him by everyone who had ever known him, to take on, instead, a mission of which he could not speak to anyone, the success of which would never be acknowledged by any human authority, the failure of which would mean his death and the loss of something that was, by Brother Gabriel's reckoning, more precious than any kingdom on earth. Aldrich was 21 years old. He should have refused. The sensible answer was no. The careful answer was no. The answer that would have led to a normal, ordinary, comfortable life back in Brittany was no. He said yes. He said yes for reasons he could not have explained, then or later. There was something about Brother Gabriel that made the offer feel like an invitation rather than a burden. There was something about the way the monk had described the treasure that made Aldrich feel, for the first time in his life, that he might be standing at the edge of a story that mattered. And there was something in his own heart, some small voice that had been speaking to him quietly since boyhood, telling him that he had been raised for something larger than the small life that had been planned for him. He said yes. And the moment he said it, his life, as he had known it, was over. Brother Gabriel did not waste time. The old monk explained, over the rest of that morning, what would happen next. Aldrich would need to disappear from St. Gilles. He would need to do so in a way that did not raise suspicion. The standard method, Brother Gabriel said, was for the knight to be reported as having died in a small skirmish that had supposedly occurred on a routine patrol. The body would never be found, of course, because there would be no body, but the report would be filed. The captain would write to the king. The king would write to the family. By the time anyone in Brittany received the news, Aldrich would be many hundreds of miles to the east, beginning his real journey. The plan worked. 2 weeks later, Sir Aldrich of Velmore was officially listed as having died in a Muslim ambush on the road south of Acre. His body was reported as having been claimed by the desert before his comrades could recover it. His personal effects, which were few, were sent home to his family in Brittany. His mother, his father, the small village in which he had grown up, all of them mourned him. And then, slowly, they began to forget him, the way villages always begin to forget young men who die in faraway lands. Aldrich, meanwhile, had ridden east with Brother Gabriel. The two of them had crossed into the territory of the Mongol Khanates, where Brother Gabriel's connections allowed them to travel safely. He had ridden for 6 weeks, through landscapes Aldrich had never imagined could exist, through cities whose names he had never heard, through mountain passes where the snow lay deeper than a man was tall. And finally, on a cold evening in late winter, they had arrived at the small monastery in the Caucasus where the treasure was being held. It was there, in that cold stone room high in the mountains, that Aldrich was finally shown what he had agreed to carry across the world. And what he saw, when the keepers opened the small wooden barks that had been hidden there for nearly 40 years, made him sink to his knees on the cold stone floor and weep, for reasons he could not at that moment have explained. He had become, in that moment, a different man. The young knight from Brittany was finished. The keeper of the treasure had begun. The journey from the Caucasus monastery to the southern coast of France took Sir Aldrich 18 months. It would be the longest, hardest, most strange and beautiful journey of his life. And though he could not have known it at the time, every mile of that journey would shape the man he would become for the rest of his days. He set out from the monastery in the early spring of 1248. He was traveling alone. This was Brother Gabriel's plan. A single traveler, dressed as a wandering merchant, was less likely to attract attention than a group. Aldrich had been given new clothes, new papers, a new identity. He was now Aldrich of Toulouse, a wool merchant returning home from a failed business venture in the eastern lands. He spoke enough French to convince anyone who asked. He spoke enough Latin to handle himself in any monastery he might need to seek shelter in. And he had been taught, over the long winter months at the Caucasus monastery, enough Greek and enough Arabic and enough Armenian to survive in the mixed populations of the lands he would cross. The treasure he carried was hidden inside a thick leather satchel that he wore on his back at all times. It looked, to anyone who saw it, like an ordinary merchant's bag. The keepers had designed it carefully. Even if a bandit took it from him, the bandit would find what appeared to be old wool samples, a few small pieces of jewelry suitable for a merchant's wife, and a worn leather purse with a modest amount of coins. The actual treasure was hidden inside a false bottom that no one not specifically looking for it would ever notice. The keepers had been doing this for 2 centuries. They knew how to hide things from people. Aldrich's first leg of the journey took him from the Caucasus, south through Anatolia, to the great city of Constantinople. He traveled with caravans when he could, alone when he had to. He stayed in monastery guest houses when he could find them. He slept in barns, in caves, in the open under the stars when there was no other choice. He ate poorly. He grew thin. His skin darkened with the sun. By the time he reached Constantinople, 6 weeks after leaving the monastery, he was no longer recognizable as the young knight who had ridden out of Brittany the year before. Constantinople in those days was a city in slow, beautiful, sad decline. It had been the greatest city in the Christian world for nearly 1,000 years. It had survived the rise and fall of empires. It had outlived a dozen plagues. But by the time Aldrich arrived there in the summer of 1248, the great city was a shadow of what it had once been. Many of its grand buildings stood empty. Many of its great churches were used only by small congregations of weary priests. The Latin Crusaders had sacked the city 40 years earlier, and the wounds of that sack had never fully healed. But the city was still beautiful. The Hagia Sophia still rose above the harbor, its dome still gleaming in the morning light. The walls of Theodosius still stood. The markets still bustled with merchants from every corner of the world. And in the small, half-empty palace of the Byzantine emperor, an old patriarch still sat on a throne that had been ancient when the kingdoms of Western Europe were still being born. Aldrich spent 2 weeks in Constantinople. The keepers had a contact there, a small bookseller in the old Greek quarter, who took Aldrich in and provided him with new clothes, new supplies, and forged papers that would help him travel further west. The bookseller was an old man with watery eyes and a slow, patient manner. He spent the evenings, while Aldrich was staying with him, telling the young knight stories about the city, about the great processions of the emperors, about the time, 2 centuries earlier, when the patriarch had walked at the head of a procession around the city walls and turned back a Bulgar invasion, about the small forgotten miracles that, the bookseller said, had been keeping the city alive long after it should have died. Aldrich listened carefully. He understood for the first time that he was carrying a piece of a much larger world than he had ever known existed. The small kingdom of Brittany, where he had grown up, was not the center of anything. It was barely even a footnote in the vast, complicated story that the bookseller was telling him. The world was older and stranger and more wonderful than Aldrich had ever realized. And he was now part of that world in a small but particular way that he could not yet fully understand. After Constantinople, Aldrich traveled west. He crossed the Bosphorus on a small fishing boat. He moved slowly through the Balkan lands, where the small Christian kingdoms of the region were locked in their endless small wars with each other, and with the Muslim emirates pressing in from the south. He spent 3 weeks in a small monastery in the mountains of Bulgaria, waiting out a particularly fierce stretch of fighting. He spent another month moving west through what would later become Serbia, traveling with a caravan of pilgrims who were on their way to Rome. By the autumn of 1248, 6 months into his journey, Aldrich had reached the eastern shores of the Adriatic. He spent another month traveling north along the coast until he came to a small port city where he was able to find a ship willing to take him across to Italy. The crossing was rough. Aldrich was sick again, the way he had been on his original voyage from Marseille to Acre. He spent 4 miserable days hanging over the rail of a small Italian merchant vessel, vomiting bile and wondering whether God had finally decided to end this strange mission by drowning him in the Adriatic. But the sea spared him. The ship arrived safely at the port of Bari in southern Italy, and Aldrich, weak and thin and tired, set foot on European soil again for the first time in nearly 2 years. He spent the winter of 1248 in southern Italy. The keepers had a contact there too, a Benedictine monastery just outside the city of Salerno, where Aldrich was able to rest, recover his strength, and prepare for the next leg of his journey. The monks of Salerno were among the finest physicians in the Christian world. They examined Aldrich and pronounced him exhausted but sound. They fed him good food. They gave him a small cell where he could sleep through the long winter nights without fear. And they did not ask him any questions about why he had come, or where he was going, or what he carried in the strange leather bag he kept always within reach. It was during that winter in Salerno that Aldrich came closest to giving up. The journey, he realized, was only half complete. He still had to cross all of Italy, then southern France, before he could deliver the treasure to its destination. He was lonely. He missed his family in Brittany, who he knew now believed him dead. He missed the simple life he might have lived, the wife he might have married, the children he might have had. He thought, more than once, about simply staying at Salerno. The monks would have welcomed him. He could have taken vows. He could have lived out his days in the warm Italian sunshine, growing slowly old in the same place, never carrying his secret further than the walls of the monastery. But he did not stay. The promise he had made to Brother Gabriel weighed too heavily. The trust the keepers had placed in him was too significant to abandon. And there was, somewhere underneath everything, a quiet stubbornness in Aldrich that he had not known he possessed before this journey. He would finish what he had started. He would carry the treasure to its destination. Whatever came after that, he would deal with when it arrived. In the early spring of 1249, Aldrich left Salerno. He rode north through Italy, through the still half-pagan countryside of the Italian south, through the warring city-states of Tuscany and Lombardy, through the foothills of the Alps. He had several close calls. In one small town in central Italy, he was robbed by a band of highwaymen who took his horse and most of his coins. He had to walk for 3 weeks before he could afford another horse. In another town, he was nearly arrested by local authorities who suspected him of being a Cathar heretic because of something about his accent that did not match his story. He talked his way out of that one barely and continued north. By midsummer, he had reached the border of Italy and France. He crossed into Provence in late June. The southern French countryside in summer was, he would later tell young brother Ansel, the most beautiful place he had ever seen in his life. The lavender fields, the small stone villages, the ancient Roman roads still in use, the friendly, weather-worn faces of the peasants in the fields. After the desert and the mountains and the foreign tongues of the east, southern France felt like coming home, even though he had never been there before. There was something in the bones of the land, in the rhythms of village life, that felt familiar to him in a way he could not have explained. He spent the summer traveling slowly west across southern France. He was getting close now. He was within a few weeks of his destination, but Brother Gabriel had warned him about the final leg of the journey. The closer he got to the destination, the more carefully he had to travel. There were people who knew. People who had been watching the keepers for centuries, looking for opportunities to intercept the treasure. The keepers did not know who these people were. They did not know what they would do if they found Aldrich. But they knew, from history, that some keepers had been killed in the final stages of their journeys, just miles from their destinations, by enemies who had been waiting for exactly this opportunity. So Aldrich moved slowly. He took winding routes. He doubled back on himself. He spent days in small villages, watching for anyone who might be watching him. He slept in different places each night. He changed his appearance regularly, sometimes shaving his beard, sometimes letting it grow out, sometimes wearing the rough wool of a peasant, sometimes the slightly finer clothes of a minor merchant. Brother Gabriel had taught him these techniques during their long winter together. They were the techniques of men who had been moving valuable secrets across hostile lands for centuries. The techniques worked. Aldrich was followed 3 times during that summer. Once by a man on a black horse who had been watching him in a market in Avignon. Once by a small group of unsavory-looking men who tracked him for 2 days through the hills outside Acre en Provence. Once by a single stranger, an old man with a withered hand, who shadowed him for nearly a week before Aldrich finally lost him in the mountains. None of his pursuers ever caught up with him. He reached the western end of his journey late in the summer, exhausted, lean, almost feral after 18 months of constant travel and constant vigilance, but still alive, still carrying the treasure, still the same young knight from Brittany who had said yes to a strange monk in an empty chapel many lifetimes before. The monastery to which he had been sent was called the Abbey of St. Cyprian. It stood on a high cliff overlooking the Mediterranean in a remote part of the southern French coast. The abbey was small. There were never more than 30 monks living there at any given time. Its grounds were modest. Its church was unremarkable. To any outsider passing by, it would have looked like dozens of other small monasteries scattered across the south of France. There was nothing about it, on the surface, to suggest that it had been chosen by an obscure council of keepers in the Eastern Christian world as the final resting place for one of the most precious treasures in Christendom. Aldrich arrived at the abbey on a warm afternoon in early September. The monks at the gate looked at him without much interest. They had been told to expect a traveller. They had not been told who. He gave the password Brother Gabriel had taught him, 6 simple words in archaic Greek that meant nothing to anyone who did not know what they were waiting to hear. The gatekeeper monk's eyes flickered. He nodded slowly. He led Aldrich inside. The abbot of St. Cyprian was a man named Father Benedict. He was perhaps 50 years old at the time, with a kind round face and eyes that had seen far more of the world than his peaceful abbey would have suggested. He had been in his position for 15 years. He had been waiting, the entire time, for the man who would arrive carrying the treasure. He had been told, when he had taken on his role, that the treasure might come in his lifetime, or it might not. He had been told to be ready for it whenever it arrived, but to never speak of it to anyone, not even his fellow monks, until the day actually came. When Aldrich was brought into Father Benedict's study, late in the afternoon of his arrival, the 2 men looked at each other for a long moment without speaking. Then Father Benedict, very slowly, made the sign of the cross. He thanked God, in a quiet voice, that the long wait had ended. He asked Aldrich to sit. He poured them both small cups of wine. And then, with the practiced calm of a man who had been preparing for this moment for 15 years, he asked Aldrich to show him what he had brought. Aldrich placed the leather satchel on the small table between them. He opened the false bottom. He took out the small wooden box that he had been carrying for 18 months. He set it on the table in front of the abbot. And he stepped back, finally, after all those miles, after all those nights, after all those small near misses with disaster, and let the treasure pass out of his hands into the keeping of the man who would now be responsible for it. Father Benedict opened the box. He looked at what was inside. His eyes filled with tears. He closed the box again, very gently, and held it in his lap for a long time, not speaking, simply being present with what he had now received. When the abbot finally looked up at Aldrich, there was something in his expression that the young knight would never forget. It was not gratitude. Exactly. It was not relief. It was something deeper. The look of a man who understood that he had been entrusted with something he did not deserve, that no one deserved, but that had to be entrusted to someone, and that he would now spend the rest of his life trying to be worthy of. "Sir Aldrich," Father Benedict said, in a voice barely above a whisper, "thank you for what you have done, for what you have brought, for the 18 months of your life that you have given to this. The treasure is safe now. It will be safe here in this abbey for as long as God permits. You have done what was asked of you. You have done it well." Aldrich nodded. He did not trust himself to speak. The abbot looked at him kindly. "You may rest now," he said. "You may stay here with us for as long as you like. You may also leave. The choice is yours. But I want you to understand before you decide that you cannot return to your old life. The world believes you are dead. To return to Brittany would be to undo, in a single moment, all the secrecy that has protected you for the past 2 years. You must choose now what kind of life you want to live going forward. And whatever you choose, I want you to know that you will always be welcome here. St. Cyprian will always have a cell waiting for you for as long as you live." Aldrich thought about this. He thought about it for several days. He walked the cliffs above the sea. He prayed in the small abbey church. He talked occasionally with Father Benedict and the other monks. And in the end, after a week of consideration, he made his decision. He would not return to the world. He could not. The old life was gone, and trying to recover it would only damage everyone he had ever loved. But he was not yet ready to take vows and become a monk himself. He was 23 years old. He had spent his entire adult life carrying a single mission. Now that the mission was complete, he needed to discover who he was outside of that mission before he could make any further commitments. He told Father Benedict that he would leave the abbey. He would travel slowly through southern France, taking work where he could find it. He would let his hair grow and let his name change. He would become a wandering knight without a kingdom, the kind of man who appeared in stories told by peasants around their fires at night. He would, in time, find a new place to call his own. But the place would not be Saint Cyprian, and it would not be Brittany, and it would not be anywhere he had ever known before. Father Benedict accepted this decision without argument. He blessed Aldrich. He gave him a small purse of coins. He gave him a horse, a good one, with strong legs and a quiet temper. And on a cool morning, in early October of 1249, Sir Aldrich of Velmore rode out of the gates of Saint Cyprian, leaving behind the treasure he had carried across half the world, and beginning the long second half of his life. He did not know it then, but he would return to Saint Cyprian. Many times. He would return because the treasure, even when it was no longer in his hands, would call him back. He would return because Father Benedict would become, over the decades that followed, his closest friend in the world. He would return because the small abbey on the cliffs above the sea was, in some way that Aldrich could not at first understand, the only place left in the world that knew the truth about who he was and what he had done. But all of that was in the future. On that October morning, in 1249, Aldrich was simply a young knight riding into the unknown, with a story behind him that he could never tell, and a story before him that he had not yet begun to live. The 40 years that followed Sir Aldrich's departure from Saint Cyprian would have made a chronicle in their own right. He travelled the southern lands of France for many years. He took work as a sword for hire, defending merchant caravans on the long roads between cities. He served briefly in the household of a minor count in the Languedoc region. He fought in 3 small wars, the kinds of small wars that filled the centuries of medieval Europe, but were never recorded in any chronicle that has survived to our day. He grew older. His hair, which had been black, became streaked with grey. The smooth face of the young knight from Brittany became weathered and lined. He acquired scars, one on his face, from a sword cut in a skirmish in 1257. One on his left arm, from a crossbow bolt that had narrowly missed his heart in 1264. One on his thigh, from a hunting accident that had nearly killed him in his middle years. He also acquired wisdom, slowly, the way men acquire wisdom only by living through many things they would have preferred not to live through. He learned that violence was never as glorious as the stories suggested it would be. He learned that even the best men he served sometimes did terrible things for ordinary reasons. He learned that the small kindnesses of strangers, in difficult moments, mattered more than any grand gesture from a king. He fell in love once. The woman's name was Mira. She was the widow of a wool merchant in the small town of Caucasus. She was 30 years old when Aldrich met her. She had 2 young children. She did not know who Aldrich really was, of course. She knew him as Aldrich of Toulouse, a wandering man-at-arms who had drifted into her town and stayed because there was something there worth staying for. They were together for 7 years. Aldrich helped raise her children as his own. He worked when he could, as a guard in the local merchants' guild. He came as close as he had ever been, and as close as he ever would be, to a normal life. Mira died in 1272 of a sudden illness that took her in 3 days. The children were old enough by then to be on their own. Aldrich stayed with them for another year, helping them establish themselves. Then he left Caucasus. He could not bear, after Mira's death, to remain in the town where they had been happy. He took to the road again, and he never settled anywhere for more than a few months for the rest of his active years. He kept in touch with Saint Cyprian throughout this time. He returned to the abbey every 2 or 3 years. He would arrive in the late afternoon, ride up to the gates, and the porter would always recognize him and let him in without a word. Father Benedict was always happy to see him. The abbot had grown old in the same place, the way Aldrich had grown old wandering. The 2 men would sit together in the small study where they had first met, and they would talk for hours about the years that had passed between them. The treasure, Father Benedict told Aldrich on each visit, was safe. The abbey had remained unbothered by the outside world. No raiders, no accusations, no suspicious visitors. The keepers of the treasure had chosen well when they had chosen Saint Cyprian. The remoteness of the location, the smallness of the community, the unremarkable nature of the abbey itself, all of these things had worked together to keep the secret protected. Father Benedict died in 1279, after 30 years as abbot of St. Cyprian. Aldrich attended the funeral. He stood at the back of the small church while the monks chanted the requiem for the man who had become his closest friend. He stayed at the abbey for several weeks afterward, mourning quietly, helping the new abbot understand what he was being asked to take on. The new abbot's name was Father Honoré. He was younger than Aldrich by several years. He had been at St. Cyprian for over a decade, and had been groomed by Father Benedict for the role for the last 5 of those. Father Honoré was a kinder, simpler man than his predecessor. He did not have Father Benedict's depth of learning or his political skill, but he had something else. A quiet, steady faith that Aldrich came to admire enormously. A faith that did not need to understand everything in order to trust that everything was as it should be. Aldrich and Father Honoré became close friends as well, though never quite as close as Aldrich had been with the older abbot. The relationship was warmer in some ways, but less intense. The two men would sit together on the cliffs above the sea in the long summer evenings, watching the sun set over the Mediterranean, talking about small, ordinary things. The treasure was rarely mentioned. It did not need to be. It was simply there, in its hidden place inside the abbey church, the silent center around which all of their lives had organized themselves. The years passed. Aldrich grew genuinely old. By the late 1280s, he was in his 60s, an age few medieval men reached, and his body was beginning to fail him in small daily ways. He could no longer sit a horse for long days at a time. He could no longer fight. He could no longer travel as he had in his middle years. He came to understand, gradually, that his wandering life was ending. The road was becoming too hard. He needed a place to settle, finally, for whatever years remained to him. In 1287, when he was 61, Aldrich returned to St. Cyprian for what he expected to be a brief visit. He stayed for the rest of his life. Father Honoré offered him a small cell in the lay quarters of the abbey, the kind of cell reserved for retired soldiers or scholars who had no remaining ties to the outside world. Aldrich accepted gratefully. He was not yet ready to take vows. He was still, at heart, a knight, even if a knight whose fighting days were behind him. But he was, finally, home. He spent the last 3 years of his life at St. Cyprian. He helped the monks with practical things, with the kinds of tasks that benefited from a man who had spent his life moving things from place to place. He told stories to the younger brothers when they asked about his travels in the eastern lands and the strange peoples and customs he had seen. He grew a small herb garden in a corner of the abbey grounds. He read books from the modest abbey library. He prayed in the small church, and he kept the secret. He never told anyone, not even Father Honoré, the full story of what he had carried across the world all those years before. The keepers had been clear, when they had selected him for the mission, that the secret was to be carried to the grave of every man who knew it, unless that man could find a worthy successor to whom it could be passed. For most of his time at St. Cyprian, Aldrich did not believe he would ever find such a successor. The young brothers of the abbey were good men, but they were not the kind of men who could be trusted with a secret of this magnitude. The keepers in the eastern lands had stopped writing to him by this point. The order had largely faded into history. Aldrich had begun to believe that the secret would die with him, and that this would be the end of an old story that had been waiting all along for an end. But then, in the spring of his last year of life, a young brother arrived at St. Cyprian. A new novice, sent by his bishop from a small town a few days inland. The new brother's name was Ansel. He was 16 years old. He was small, thin, with deep dark eyes, and a quiet way of moving through the world. He spoke little. He listened well. He had been sent to St. Cyprian because his bishop had recognized in him something unusual, something that the small parish church of his hometown had not been able to nurture. The bishop had thought, correctly, that Ansel might find his true vocation in a contemplative monastery far from the noise of the world. Aldrich noticed Ansel within his first weeks at the abbey. He noticed first the boy's quietness. He noticed the way Ansel listened when other people spoke, with full attention, without interrupting, without thinking about what he himself wanted to say next. He noticed the way Ansel treated everyone the same way, the senior monks and the lay servants, the visiting pilgrims and the children of the village down the road. There was no calculation in him, no social hierarchy. He saw people as they were, and he treated them accordingly. Aldrich watched Ansel for nearly a year. He spoke with him sometimes, casually, the way an old man speaks to a young one in a small monastery where everyone knows everyone. Ansel did not know who Aldrich was, of course. He did not know about the treasure. He did not know that the old retired knight he occasionally helped with the herb garden was the only living person who had ever carried what was hidden in the heart of the abbey church. But by the autumn of 1290, Aldrich had decided. The young brother Ansel was the one. He was the keeper Aldrich had been waiting to find. The keeper to whom the secret could be safely passed before Aldrich himself died. It was a few weeks later, on the morning when Aldrich finally felt the cold of his last fever taking him, that he asked the porter brother to bring Ansel to his cell. This brings us, traveller, to the morning where this story began. Brother Ansel sat by the bed of the dying knight. The autumn sun came through the small window. The sea murmured below. And Sir Aldrich of Velmore, the young knight from Brittany who had become the keeper of a treasure no one was supposed to know about, told the young brother everything he had been carrying alone for 43 years. He told him about Brother Gabriel and the empty chapel at St. Gilles. He told him about the long winter in the Caucasus and the moment of seeing the treasure for the first time. He told him about the 18-month journey across half the world. He told him about Father Benedict and Father Honoré and Mira, whom he had loved, and all the small ordinary moments that had filled his strange and extraordinary life. He told the boy what the treasure actually was, the thing he had not been allowed to speak of for 43 years. He told him because the boy was now the keeper. The boy would be responsible for it after Aldrich was gone. The boy would, someday, when he was older, need to find his own successor. The chain that had stretched back to the very early days of the church would continue, through this small monastery on the cliffs of southern France, through this quiet boy with the dark eyes, through whoever came after him in the long ages still to come. What the treasure was, traveller, I cannot tell you. The vows that bound Aldrich and Ansel and all the keepers before them bind us still. But I can tell you this. It was something worth a knight giving up his entire life to carry. It was something worth an abbot devoting his whole career to protecting. It was something that has, in its quiet hidden way, been part of the story of the Christian world for nearly 2,000 years, even though almost no one alive today has ever heard of it. Ansel listened to the dying knight for many hours. The sun moved across the sky. The afternoon came. Aldrich grew weaker. Toward evening, when his voice was failing, he gave Ansel his last instructions. The boy was to find Father Honoré and tell him that the secret had been passed. The boy was to begin, slowly, his preparation for the role he would now carry. The boy was to live the rest of his life with this knowledge inside him, knowing that he was responsible for the protection of something larger than any one person, something that would outlive him by centuries. The young knight from Brittany died at sunset on that autumn day. His last words were not directed at the boy. They were directed at someone Ansel could not see. Aldrich called out, very softly, the name of Mira, his beloved who had died 17 years before. He spoke a few words to her in a voice that was almost a whisper. He smiled, and then he was gone. Ansel sat with him for a long time after he died. The boy did not weep. He understood in a way that surprised him that weeping was not the right response. The old knight had finished his long mission. He had found a successor. He had passed the burden. He had been allowed at the end to die with peace. There was sadness in the room, but it was a clean sadness. The sadness of a long story that had ended exactly as it should have ended. The boy went, after a while, to find Father Honoré. He told the abbot what had happened. The abbot understood immediately what was being said. He had been told by Father Benedict before his death that this day would eventually come. He had been hoping, secretly, that the day would not come during his own time, that the keeper Aldrich would find would be someone who arrived after Father Honoré himself was gone. But the day had come. Brother Ansel was the new keeper, and Father Honoré now had to begin the long, careful work of teaching the boy what he needed to know. Ansel served as the keeper of the treasure for 67 years. He outlived 3 abbots. He saw the great plague of the 14th century come and go. He watched the small monastery survive wars and famines and political upheavals that no one had foreseen. When he was very old, sometime in the year 1357, he passed the secret on, in his turn, to a young novice named Brother Marcel, who would carry it through the rest of the 14th century and into the early 15th. The chain of keepers continued, century after century. The names of most of them have not survived. The treasure remained in its hiding place at St. Cyprian for nearly 500 years, until the religious upheavals of the 18th century forced the keepers to move it again, this time to a different location whose name has never been written down by anyone outside the order. There it has remained, the keepers say, ever since. This is, in the end, what Sir Aldrich's story is really about. Not about a single quest, not about a single night, about a chain of human beings stretching back across centuries, who have given their lives to protect something that was given to them by people they never met, on behalf of people who would never know their names. It is a story about the kind of devotion that does not seek recognition, that does not require reward, that does not even require the person doing the work to fully understand what they are doing. It is a story about the deep, slow, patient work of carrying things across time. Most of the great treasures of the world have been lost, burned in fires, stolen by armies, forgotten in the long sweep of centuries. But some treasures have survived. They have survived because, in every generation, there have been people willing to give their lives to protect them. People like Sir Aldrich of Velmore, who gave up his family and his kingdom and the woman he loved to carry a small wooden barks across half the world. People like Brother Ansel, who gave up the simple monastic life he had been planning to spend 67 years, guarding a secret he could speak of with only one or two other people. These are the kinds of stories the great chronicles do not tell. The chronicles tell us about kings and battles, and the rise and fall of empires. They do not tell us about the small, quiet people who, in the deep places of the world, have spent their lives protecting things the great powers do not even know exist. Those small, quiet people are out there. They have always been out there. And as long as there are things in this world worth protecting, there will be people who give their lives to protect them. That, in the end, is the story Sir Aldrich told Brother Ansel on the morning he died. A story not of conquest, not of glory, not of victory in battle. A story of the long, quiet, patient work of carrying something precious across the years, from one hand to another, in the hope that someday, somewhere, it will reach the place it was always meant to be. Settle in, traveler. The fire is burning low. The night is moving toward its long, quiet middle hours. Sleep well. Whatever has stirred in you tonight can rest now, in the deep, quiet places of your dreams. And if this story has reached you, on whatever night you have come to it, know that you are also part, in some small way, of the long chain of people who have heard it and remembered it and carried it forward. The story itself is, in its way, a small treasure. It has come to you across many hands. It has been kept alive by people who loved it enough to tell it again. And now it is yours, for whatever time you wish to keep it. Good night. If this story has brought you peace tonight, take a moment to subscribe to the Forgotten Ages. Every week we tell another tale from the long, deep past. Stories of knights and monks, of forgotten kingdoms, of the small, ordinary people who lived in worlds we have only dimly remembered. Sleep well. Dream deeply. And when you are ready, we will be here with another story waiting for you.